The sand was the same, the trees were the same, but the silence was new. John White moved slowly across the pale shoreline, each footstep sinking into the soft sand with a muted thud. The air hung still around him, heavy and cool, clinging to his clothes as he walked. Behind him, the ship rocked gently on the quiet water, its wooden hull groaning in low, tired notes that faded before reaching the dunes. Ahead of him lay the ridge, familiar, unchanged, yet carrying a weight he could not name. He paused at the base of the dune, letting his hand brush across the dry, wind-shaped sand. The grains shifted beneath his fingertips, rolling in tiny cascades that whispered against his skin. It felt the same as it had years before, yet the air around it felt colder, denser, as if the island were wrapped in something untouched by time, yet altered by absence. White drew a long breath and began to climb. The wind pressed gently against his back, nudging loose grains down the slope as he ascended. Grass sprouted in tall, slender lines along the path, bending and swaying with the slow rhythm of the breeze. Some stalks brushed lightly against his boots, making faint, dry sounds that seemed louder than they should have been. He remembered the sound of laughter up here, the small shouts of children chasing one another between the dunes, the clatter of tools, the ordinary noise of living. But as he reached the crest, the landscape below opened before him with a hollow quiet that made his chest tighten. The path into the settlement stretched ahead like a faded memory, overgrown, narrow, nearly hidden beneath patches of wild grass and creeping vines. Once, wagon wheels had carved deep ruts into this soil, and dozens of feet had packed it firm. Now it looked untouched, light, fragile, as though the next gust of wind might erase it completely. White stepped forward. The grass brushed against his legs, releasing a faint scent of crushed stems. He could feel dew clinging to the blades, gathering on his boots. Each step produced a soft, muffled sound, absorbed almost instantly by the thick stillness around him. His men followed at a respectful distance. They did not speak. Even their breathing seemed subdued, as if carried inward rather than out into the open. The quiet pressed in around all of them, deep and unmoving, like a held breath stretching across the entire island. The palisade soon came into view, tall wooden stakes rising unevenly into the sky. Some leaned slightly, slanted by storms or time, creating a jagged, irregular silhouette. The surface of the wood was grey and dry, marked with long vertical cracks. Salt and wind had carved shallow lines into the grain, giving each stake a weathered, rough texture. As White approached, he listened to the faint creaking of the structure. Each shift of the wind made the stakes rub gently against one another, producing soft groans that drifted into the air. Those sounds, though small, felt strangely alive in the silence, echoing just long enough to stir the overgrown grass nearby. The base of the palisade was covered in a tangle of vines. Thick stems twisted upward, clinging to the wood, their leaves trembling faintly in the breeze. Some vines had found their way into the cracks, splitting the wood further. Others curled around fallen branches or stretched across the entrance as though trying to weave the settlement shut. White slowed his steps and placed a hand on the nearest stake. The wood felt cool beneath his palm, damp in the deeper cracks. powdery near the surface. He traced the lines of rot and age, feeling where the grain had softened. No hands had cared for this structure in years. Nature had been its only keeper. His gaze lifted. That was when he noticed the carving. The letters were cut deep, carefully, with intention. They stood out in sharp relief against the weathered wood, their grooves still dark, untouched by the bleached surface around them. CROATOAN. White stepped closer. The letters were large, each stroke of the blade firm and confident. He leaned in until his eyes could follow the fine texture left inside the cuts. The wood there was lighter, protected from sun and weather. Smooth in some places, slightly ridged in others where the blade had caught on knots in the grain. He lifted a finger and gently traced the first C. The inner surface felt almost polished. The strokes followed a steady pattern, the hand behind them calm, deliberate, not rushed, not panicked. Whoever carved this had known exactly what they meant to say. Behind him, one of his men shifted his weight, his armor giving off a soft metallic scrape. The sound rang faintly, then died into the surrounding quiet. Even that small noise felt foreign, as though it did not belong in this hollow stillness. White lowered his hand and stepped back, letting his eyes linger on the word. The wind moved through the palisade again, producing a long, low creak. The letters seemed to watch him through the drifting shadows, holding their meaning close but unspoken. He turned toward the gate. The wooden entrance hung slightly open, its lower hinge resting unevenly. A gentle push from the wind made it rock, emitting a tired groan that stretched into the grass. The sound travelled softly, fading just before reaching the line of empty houses inside. White stepped forward. He placed his hand on the door and pushed slowly. The wood resisted at first, then surrendered with a long, dragging creak. Inside the settlement, the air felt cooler, denser, as if the walls around him trapped a stillness that had gone untouched for far too long. The ground was blanketed with growth. Melon vines spread across the earth in tangled patterns, their stems thick and curling. The leaves were broad, muted in colour, moving in slow waves as the breeze passed through them. Some vines had grown over pieces of fallen wood. Others wrapped themselves around the posts of abandoned homes. White crouched and touched one of the vines. The surface felt smooth and slightly cool. The leaves had a weight to them, heavy with moisture. He pressed his fingers into the soil beneath. It was soft, uneven. Years of roots and fallen leaves had gathered into a thick layer that muffled the sound of his movement. He rose and walked deeper into the settlement. The houses stood in solemn lines, their shapes familiar, yet hollow. Wooden beams sagged under the strain of time. Roofs drooped, some missing shingles, others bowed inward as if exhausted. Doors swung gently in the wind or hung loose from their hinges. He stopped at the first doorway and looked inside. The shadows were deep, still. Nothing stirred. The interior held no belongings, no tools, no furniture. Just open space where daily life had once moved with small, ordinary sounds. He took another step. His boot brushed against a dry piece of wood, and it rolled slightly, making a sharp, small click. The sound cut through the air, echoing across the walls before being swallowed by silence again. White moved on, his steps slow. Each house he passed felt colder than the last. Some had collapsed inward, the beams broken, the vines pulling them closer to the earth. Others stood tall but empty, holding only dust and the faint scent of old wood. At one house, he paused. A roof beam creaked gently overhead. The sound was long and low, like a quiet groan. The breeze shifted, pushing through the gaps in the walls and making the entire structure give a tired shudder. White stepped back, watching the way the shadows inside shifted slightly as the wind moved through the open spaces. It looked as though the house were breathing. A slow, heavy rise and fall. But it was only the wind, only the emptiness. He walked toward the well at the center of the settlement. Grass had grown up around its stones, sprouting in thick tufts that swayed in uneven patterns. The rope was gone, the bucket missing. Only the circular opening remained, dark and silent. He leaned over it. The air that rose from below felt cold, damp. It carried no scent of use, only the faint smell of earth long undisturbed. Turning away, he let his gaze drift across the village. The melon vines, the leaning houses, the empty paths between them. No signs of struggle, no broken arrows, no scattered belongings. Nothing that spoke of violence or panic. Just absence. A complete, heavy absence. His men spread out slowly, their movements cautious. One brushed aside a cluster of vines to examine a fallen beam. Another gently pushed open a door, letting it creak into the quiet. But none found anything. Every corner of the village held the same stillness, the same undisturbed emptiness. White eventually reached the very center of the settlement, a space once used for meetings, meals, work. A place where voices had overlapped and blended into the soft, familiar sound of community. Now there was only wind, grass brushing against wood, and the distant, rhythmic creaking of the palisade. He stood there, the silence settling onto his shoulders like a weight. He turned slowly, letting his eyes pass over each empty house, each patch of overgrowth, each shadow. The people he had known, his family, his friends, the colonists he had promised to return for, they were nowhere, not hidden, not waiting, simply gone. The wind pushed gently through the vines, creating a faint rustling that moved across the settlement in slow waves. The grass bowed, the wooden beams answered with soft groans, and the silence returned, thicker than before. White remained in the center of the empty village, surrounded by abandoned homes and quiet shadows, realizing, with every slow breath he took, that the colony he had come to find no longer remained. They were gone. Completely. Irrevocably. Gone.